Hello everyone, welcome to PMFIS. I am Dr. Vishwjeet Kawar. In last lecture, we have seen this Vedic period from 1500 BCE to 600 BCE or 500 BCE. In today's lecture, we are going to see the Vedic literature, means text composed during this Vedic period. Before we start this Vedic literature, we will just revise this Vedic period. It starts around 1500 BC. So from around 2000 to 1500 BC, during this period, speakers of Indo-Aryan language or Indo-European language, they migrated from Russian steppes to northwestern part of Indian subcontinent. This region we call it the Sapta Sindhu region. Sapta Sindhu region. Why Sapta Sindhu region? Sapta means 7. Sindhu means river Indus. So it consists of 7 rivers. First is Indus river. Then its 5 tributaries. Which are these 5 tributaries? Jhelum, Chenab, Ravi, Bias and Satluj. And next is Saraswati. So these speakers of Indo-Aryan language, they migrated from Russian steppes to Sapta Sindhu region or northwestern part of Indian subcontinent. Around this 1500 BCE, they composed Rigveda or Rigveda. So around this period, they composed this Rigveda. That's why we call this as a Rigvedic period. This early Vedic period from 1500 BCE to 1000 BCE, we called it as a Rigveda. Then around this 1000 BC, they migrated towards east from this northwestern part of Indian subcontinent, that is Sapta Sindhu region, to this western UP part. And here they composed this later Vedic text. Remember, during this early time, they composed only Rigveda. During this later Vedic period, they composed Yajurveda, Samaveda, Atharvaveda, as well as Brahmanas, Aranyakas and Upanishads around in the west part of UP or westernmost part of Uttar Pradesh. Later they migrated towards east, means eastern UP and Bihar. So if you want to reconstruct the history of this early Vedic period, we are dependent on Rigveda. That's why early Vedic period is also called as Rigvedic period from 1500 to 1000 BC. This later Vedic period is 1000 to 600 or 500 BC. This is called as later Vedic period. So in this lecture, we are going to see the composition during this early Vedic period and later Vedic period. In last lecture, we have also discussed social, economic and political condition during early Vedic period and later Vedic period. How the condition of women was better during this early Vedic period than this later Vedic period. In this lecture, we are specifically dealing about this Vedic literature. So in this lecture, we will see this Vedic literature. Vedic literatures. Remember, there are 4 Vedas or 4 Veds. Which are these? Rigveda, Yajurveda, Samaveda and Atharvaveda. 4 Veds are Rigveda, Yajurveda, then Samaveda and Atharvaveda. So this Yajurveda is again divided into Krishna Yajurveda and Shukla Yajurveda. So remember, in this Vedic literature, there are basically 4 Veds. Which are these 4 Veds? Rigveda, Yajurveda, Samaveda and Atharvaveda. For each Ved is again divided into 4 type of text, 4 different types of text. Which are these? First is Samhita, then Brahmanas, then Aranyakas, and last Upanishads. So remember, there are Rigvedic Samhita or Rigvedic Samhita. There are Brahmanas of Rigveda. There are Aranyakas of Rigveda and Upanishad of Rigveda. So each Ved is again divided into 4 different types of text. Which are these? Samhita, Brahmanas, Aranyakas and Upanishad. Remember, if you consider this Rigveda Samhita, we can directly call this as a Rigveda, means synonymous for this Rigveda Samhita, or we generally prefer to call this Rigveda Samhita as Rigveda. Yajurveda Samhita as Yajurveda, Samaveda Samhita as Samaveda, and Atharvaveda Samhita as Atharvaveda. Means if someone is talking about this Rigveda Samhita, means they are talking about Rigveda. Or if in general I am talking about this Atharvaveda, means I am talking about this Atharvaveda Samhita. For all these we also have these different names, but remember these are synonymous terms. If in next lecture I am talking about this Samaveda, means I am talking about this Samaveda Samhita. So what are these Samhita, what are these Brahmanas, what are these Aranyakas, and what are these Upanishads? We will see one by one, but our intention in this lecture is only study those parts which are important for exam. We don't go in too much depth. Now we will see the Samhitas. Samhitas. So for each Veda we have Samhita. So first is Rigveda. We called it as a Rigveda or Rigveda Samhita. Next Yajurveda or Yajurveda Samhita. Next Samaveda or Samaveda Samhita, and Atharvaveda or Atharvaveda Samhita. Remember, you can directly call it as a Rigveda. Rigveda in general term means Rigveda Samhita. Yajurveda in general term means Yajurveda Samhita. So what is this Rigveda Samhita? So basically Rigveda Samhita consists of hymns or suktas, means like modern devotional songs, hymns or suktas in praise of various gods or deities, means praising gods or deities. Remember Vedic Samhita, it consists of hymns or suktas, means like devotional song. You can correlate, there are basically 1028 hymns or suktas praising different gods. So what is this Yajurveda? Yajurveda basically contains manuals for a priest, means they have given these different rules for the priest, how to perform, what are the rules to follow during rituals or sacrifices. So what is this Rigveda? Yajurveda. Yajurveda means these are basically, it contains manual for priest, manual for priest, rules to be followed during rituals and sacrifices. So this is basically a manual for a priest. If you consider this Samaveda, Samaveda means many consider this Samaveda as a origin of Indian music. Why? In Samaveda, most of the hymns were directly taken from Rigveda. Most of the hymns were directly taken from Rigveda. There are plus additional some hymns, they were just rearranged. These hymns were rearranged and given this music, or they were set in this tune, so that they can sing during these rituals and sacrifices. If you see this Atharvaveda, in Atharvaveda, most of the hymns were charms or magic spells. Basically you call this as a Jadoo Tona, something like that. So this is about this Atharvaveda. Atharvaveda contains hymns, most of which are charms or magic spells to ward off disease or for this protection from snake bite, etc. So if you see this Rigveda Samhita or Rigveda, means it contains hymns or sukta in praise of various gods or deities. If you consider this Yajurveda, what is given in the Yajurveda? Instruction or rules to be followed during these rituals or sacrifices. What is given in the Samaveda? Most of the hymns were directly taken from Rigveda. Only these are rearranged and has given this tune or music. In Atharvaveda, you will find this charms and magic spells, means basically you have to do certain things to get rid of these diseases and all. So this is all about this Samhita. Remember, for Rigveda Samhita you can directly call it as a Rigveda. For Yajurveda Samhita you can directly call it as a Yajurveda. Similarly for Samaveda and Atharvaveda. Then what are these Brahmanas? What are these Brahmanas? Brahmanas means basically commentaries on Samhita. They basically explain the meaning of rituals. So basically Brahmanas means commentaries on Vedas, and they explain about the different rituals. Then what are these Aranyakas? Aranya is term used for forest. So here in Aranyakas they have given different rites to be followed for this forest people or Vanaprastha. And last is Upanishad. What are these Upanishads? Upanishad means basically philosophical. They talk about this, or it deals with this soul or karma or rebirth. These are the different themes of this Upanishad. Means basically Upanishad is philosophical text. We will see one by one. If you consider these Brahmanas, Brahmanas means basically they are commentaries on this Samhita, but they basically explain these rituals. If you consider this Aranyakas, Aranyakas are specifically only for those people who are in this forest, like Vanaprastha. It has given different rites or explain these different meanings of rituals for those who are living in the forest. And last one is Upanishad. Upanishad means basically philosophical text. They deals about this karma, rebirth and soul. Now we will directly see these Upanishads. But before that, we will first see Rigveda Samhita in detail. We have in general seen this Rigveda Samhita, Yajurveda Samhita, Atharvaveda, Samaveda and Atharvaveda. Now we will see this Rigveda Samhita, or we can directly call it as a Rigveda. Similarly, for Yajurveda Samhita, you can directly call it as a Yajurveda. So we have already seen in last lecture, Rigveda was composed in early Vedic period around 1500 BC. So this was the earliest text composed in Indian subcontinent. So around this 1500 BC in Saptasindhu region. So it consists of 1028 hymns or suktas. So these hymns or suktas were basically dealing about this praising various gods or deities. Remember, most important god was Indra. Then second most important was Agni. Then Varun, and next Soma. Because basically these Rigvedic hymns, these were in praise of various gods or deities. If you consider this Indra, Rigveda has also mentioned some name Purandar. Purandar means destroyer of fort. This is the most important god during this Rigvedic time. If you consider this Agni, Agni was second most important god. Agni is basically used in this rituals and all, right? You pour this ghee and etc. during this ritual. So Agni was important. So Agni was considered as intermediary between people and God. If you consider this Varun, Varun was third most important god. Varun was a god of ocean. God of ocean or water. And Soma was fourth most important god. Basically Soma was actually a plant. God of plant, from which this intoxicating drink Soma was prepared. So in general, Rigveda consists of hymns, 1028 hymns or suktas in praise of various gods or deities. Which are these gods important? Indra, Agni, Varun and Soma. Remember, this Rigveda or Rigveda Samhita is not a single book. It consists of 10 books. And 10 books. For individual book we called it as a mandal, or these 10 books we called as a mandals. Out of these 10 books, 2nd to 7th were composed during this early Vedic period. Which were composed during this early Vedic period? 2nd to 7th means 6 books. 6 books were composed during this early Vedic period. We also call them as a family books. Why family books? Because different family of sages or rishis were prepared this book. From 2nd to 7th means 6 books were prepared during this early Vedic period. And 1st, then 8th, 9th and 10th. These were prepared during this later Vedic period. So 2nd to 7th means these 6 books were prepared during this early Vedic period, and 1st, 8th, 9th and 10th were prepared during this later Vedic period. So this is all about this Rigveda Samhita. Remember, you don't have to remember all these 1028 hymns or suktas, but 2 suktas are extremely important. Which are these? First is Nasadiya Sukta. And second is Purush Sukta. Both are from this 10th mandalas. 10th mandalas means both were composed during this later Vedic period, because these are from this 10th mandalas. This Purush Sukta basically deals with classification or division in 4 groups: Brahmanas, Kshatriya, Vaishyas and Shudras. And this Nasadiya Sukta, it specifically deals about this origin of universe. Origin of universe. So these are the things which are important for you to remember about this Rigveda Samhita, or in general Rigveda. It consists of hymns 1028 or suktas, which were basically praise with related to these different gods: Indra, Agni, Varun and Soma. Then this Rigveda is not a single book, or Rigvedic Samhita is not a single book. It consists of 10 books. We call this as a mandalas. 2nd to 7th means these 6 books were composed during this early Vedic period, and remaining 4 were composed during this later Vedic period. You have to remember 2 suktas, Nasadiya Sukta and Purush Sukta. Now for your exam, these Brahmanas and Aranyakas are not that important. We will directly see this Upanishad. Upanishads. So what are these Upanishads? Upanishads are basically philosophical text. These are philosophical text, deals with soul, individual souls, we call it as Atman, or universal soul, we call that Brahman, then karma, then rebirth. These are the things which are dealt in this Upanishad. So basically Upanishads are philosophical text. If you see this Vedas, Rigveda, Yajurveda, Samaveda, or their types, Brahmanas, Aranyakas and Brahmanas and Aranyakas, basically, or Samhitas, they talk about these rituals. They talk about these rituals. But Upanishad is a philosophical text. It criticizes these rituals. According to Upanishad, you can get the moksha, or liberation from this cycle of birth and rebirth, only by acquiring knowledge. You will get moksha by acquiring knowledge, not by doing these rituals. So basically Upanishads were criticizing these rituals. According to Upanishad, you will get the moksha if you understand the knowledge, if you understand individual soul and universal soul, means knowledge about individual soul or Atman, and knowledge about universal soul or Brahman. If you get this knowledge about individual soul and universal soul and relation between them, if you understand these things, individual soul and universal soul and relation between them, then you will get this moksha. Means according to this Upanishad, you don't have to do any rituals to get the moksha. That's why these Upanishads are also called as Vedanta. Ved, Anta means end. Why it is called as Vedanta, end of Vedas? Because it is basically talking about this, how to get moksha. Ultimate aim of Veda, or end goal of Veda, is to get moksha. And this Upanishad is talking about this moksha, how to get this moksha. So that's why we call them as a Vedanta. These Upanishads are called as Vedanta. Basically Upanishads are talking about these philosophical things, like complex philosophical things. Understanding or saying this philosophy or explaining these philosophical things is not easy. So Upanishad used various parables. Upanishad has used various parables. Parables means if Upanishad wants to explain some things, they will take stories. They will take different stories to explain their complex phenomena. Like there is a story of Uddalaka and Shvetaketu. Uddalaka and Shvetaketu, this story is given in Chandogya Upanishad. This story is given in Chandogya Upanishad. Then again there is a story of Gargi. Story of Gargi, it is given in Katha Upanishad. Katha Upanishad. Then again third important is, there is one again, means first is Uddalaka and Shvetaketu, next is Gargi and Yama Nachiket. Story of Yama and Nachiket. This story of Yama and Nachiket, this story of Gargi is given in Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, and this story of Yama and Nachiket, it is given in Katha Upanishad. Katha Upanishad. There are different parables in this Upanishad, but you just have to remember 3 parables for your exam. First is story of Uddalaka and Shvetaketu given in this Chandogya Upanishad. Then story of Gargi given in Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, and then story of Yama and Nachiket given in Katha Upanishad. So these are the things which are important for you about this Upanishad. Now we will see this table once again. This Vedic literature. So Vedic literature consists of 4 Ved: Rigveda, Yajurveda, Samaveda and Atharvaveda, and each Ved consists of 4 things, 4 texts: Samhita, Brahmanas, Aranyakas and Upanishads. We have seen this Samhita. Then Brahmanas, what are these Brahmanas? Brahmanas means commentaries on this Samhita, and they also explain these rituals. Aranyakas, these are the forest book, and Upanishads, these are the philosophical books. Now we will see these Brahmanas of Rigveda. If you see this Rigveda, 2 important Brahmanas are, first is Aitreya Brahmana and second is Kaushitki Brahmana. Aitreya Brahmana and Kaushitki Brahmana. Similarly, if you see this Aranyakas, Aitreya Aranyaka and Kaushitki Aranyakas. If you see this Upanishad, Aitreya Upanishad and Kaushitki Upanishad. This is about this Rigveda, Rigvedic Samhita, Brahmanas, Aranyakas and Upanishad. If you see this Yajurveda, there is Krishna Yajurveda. Important Brahmanas of Krishna Yajurveda is Taitreya Upanishad. Taitreya Upanishad. Similarly here Taitreya Aranyakas and Taitreya Brahmanas, Taitreya Aranyakas and Taitreya Upanishad. So these are the texts about this Krishna Yajurveda. Now next is Shukla Yajurveda. For Shukla Yajurveda, remember this important Brahmana is Shatpad Brahmana. Shatpad Brahmana. Then if you consider this Aranyakas, Brihad Aranyakas and Brihad Upanishad. Remember these are the important Brahmanas, Aranyakas and Upanishad about this Shukla Yajurveda. You have to remember one important Upanishad related to this Atharvaveda, Manduka Upanishad. Manduka Upanishad. Why this Upanishad is important? Because if you see our national motto Satyameva Jayate, it is taken from this Manduka Upanishad. You can also remember this KBC, Kaun Banega Karodpati. Like here Katha Upanishad, then Brihadaranyaka Upanishad and Chandogya Upanishad. Chandogya Upanishad. So these are the important texts which are important for your exam. If you consider Samhita, for Samhita you don't have to remember any name. Rigveda Samhita, Yajurveda Samhita, Samveda Samhita and Atharvaveda Samhita. For this Brahmanas, remember these 2 important in this Rigveda, Aitreya Brahmana and Kaushitki Brahmana. Similarly for Aranyakas, Aitreya Aranyakas and Kaushitki Aranyakas. Similarly for Upanishad, Aitreya Upanishad and Kaushitki Upanishad. For this Krishna Yajurveda, remember this Taitreya Brahmana, then Taitreya Aranyaka and Taitreya Upanishad. For this Shukla Yajurveda, remember this Shatpad Brahmana, then Brihad Aranyaka and Brihad Aranyak Upanishad. Then here remember this KBC, Katha Upanishad, Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad and Chandogya Upanishad. For this Atharvaveda, most important text is this Manduka Upanishad. Why this is important? Because our national motto Satyameva Jayate is taken from this Manduka Upanishad. So these are the different things or important points from this Vedic literature. We have already seen in last lecture difference between early Vedic period and later Vedic period. In this lecture we have seen about this different Vedic literature. Remember there are 4 texts, which are these Rigveda, Yajurveda, Samveda and Atharvaveda, and for individual text we also have these 4 different texts, which are these Samhita, Brahmanas, Aranyakas and Upanishad. So revise all these things. In next lecture we will start this 6th century BC or period of Mahajanpadas. Until then, goodbye.